This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Borderonay. The two of us are partners at the office and, of course, hosts of the show. And today it's the two of us, and we're going to talk about Marina's favorite 3 buildings. Your 3 favorite buildings.
There might be more than 3.
It was like 5 or 6. Why you liked those 3, and thoughts that came about as a result of these 3 buildings.
I feel like people are going to be like, oh, wow, she picked like old buildings. Like she didn't pick like recent ones or something. And that's true because most of my favorite are the old ones.
Oh, well, gosh.
Yeah. No,
kind of
I mean,
aggressive
it's true.
there. I mean, that's interesting because most of the time when you ask people what their favorite film is or their architecture is, they don't name
Recent
something
ones.
contemporary.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So, little food for thought there. So that's a recording, right?
Yep.
I'm surprised you didn't have more to say about the 3 buildings.
Well, you just kept talking. It's Marina's 3 favorite buildings, but it's mostly David talking about them.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, that's good.
So we do the opposite. Yeah, we do the opposite
good.
in the
Teaser.
next episode. Yeah.
Sponsors.
Designers and architects, if you're looking for a powerful and real-time visualization and VR tool, then check out Enscape. Why is Enscape special? Well, it's super easy to use because it's a plugin and not a standalone application, which means you can work directly in your SketchUp, Rhino, ArchiCAD, Vectorworks, or Revit model. It only takes a couple clicks from installation to creating your first rendering. Enscape does realistic renderings, 360-degree panoramas and videos, and virtual reality environment. We use Enscape and we think you will love it too, so click the Enscape 3D link in our show notes to learn more.
I used to start remodeling projects with hours of tedious measuring and recreating the existing conditions. Then I discovered Canvas, an iPad and iPhone app that lets me easily scan entire homes in minutes and automatically generates editable models in formats like SketchUp, ArchiCAD, Vectorworks, Revit, and more in as little as 1 day. Thanks to Canvas, I spend more time designing the future instead of measuring the past. Get to the design phase faster with Canvas. Visit canvas.io/SSP or click the link in our show notes to schedule your demo and get your first as-built free. This is The Second Studio with myself and Marina. Here we go. Everyone's waiting to know, what is your first favorite building?
You know, I have to say we ask this question to every guest, and it is a pretty annoying question. And I think in general, I'm not the best one at having like my favorite whatever. It goes for a lot of things. So this was not easy to think about, and I will probably be changing my mind tomorrow about which ones are my favorite buildings.
Of course.
But, you know, to answer the question...
you have 3, so what's the first one?
Okay, so there is going to be 3 buildings mentioned. They're not necessarily in order.
That's okay.
Okay, because, again, I don't really play that game usually of playing favorites. And actually, I might still be changing my mind as I'm speaking.
Oh, no, this is terrible.
It is terrible. It is terrible. Okay, let's do the first one. I would say the first one, and it might not be very surprising or very not interesting, but it might not be like revolutionary.
You are really building up the suspense here.
I am. So the first one would probably be...
Oh my God, get to it already. God.
I'm still thinking.
Did you prepare for this, or are you winging it?
But I'm not sure. I mean,
I will hold you to it.
They are old buildings that I love.
I would expect so. Yes, if they're
again, I don't know if they're really my favorite, but they're maybe the 3 that comes to mind. The first one, not in order of preference.
This is painful for listeners. This is painful for me.
I'm about to tell you. You keep interrupting me.
Okay.
Oh, gosh. So my first one would be probably the Farnsworth house.
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, let's Google.
Yeah, you can't steal that one.
Farnsworth house. Let me turn down the computer volume. Farnsworth house, Mies van der Rohe. Any architects listening know this house, of course, and probably non-architects might know this house. This house is not nearly as well known as Falling Water for sure, but it's in the architecture world. Everyone knows it. All right, so talk me through your reasoning.
All right.
Here.
Well, first of all, I have a sweet spot for anything mid-century, which I think this one would probably fall into.
Okay.
There is something very poetic when I remember when we went to visit this house, and it might have been also because we kind of like went out of the beaten path to go see it, and it wasn't like, okay, I'm in a big city and I'm gonna go see like one of the top 5 buildings that you should see if you go visit I don't know, Chicago or whatever. Like it was kind of like you had to do a journey to get to the building, which builds up the anticipation, and maybe also it's because I come from France. I come where there is a lot of like tradition, old buildings, history, and all of that stuff, and preservation, and crafts and vernacular and all of these things. And so this is to me like a very modern, very simple. It's kind of like the opposite of maybe like what I grew up and where I'm from, so therefore I'm very drawn to it. It's also super simple but extremely powerful of a house and extremely smart. So within the landscape, like the house just kind of like floats above the ground. It's only a few steps up. It's nothing fancy. The facade is just glass, a roof, and a few posts and beams, and that's it. So it's
literally
kind of like
a few. There's like 8 posts.
Yeah, it's really like, how can you do a house that with the bare things that you need in some ways and still make it very very elegant. I do love that it's white and glass because it contrasts with the green landscape around it, but it also doesn't obstruct it, right? Like the lights just go through, and you really have glass just because that's what you need to do to make a house is just close it off from the exteriors. But it's very, very simple. And so that's kind of like the aesthetic, the exterior, like the design. But I think what fascinates me about this house is the floor plan.
Yeah.
And again, the optimization of the floor plan, the radicalness of the floor plan, and the simplicity of it. Like it's nothing oversized. There is no partition walls between spaces. It's really like, how can you just position the program and the rooms next to each other without necessarily having a line between them,
right.
Which I found very fascinating. And even the entry porch, like what is an entry is just a suspended platform that's a certain size in front of a door, and maybe a portion gets covered, and that's how you enter, and that's it. You don't need anything else. So I do really like this house, again, because of the extreme efficiency and rationale behind it, but also the simplicity and the poetic that could come from that.
How do you feel about Philip Johnson's glass house?
I've never been, so I am not super familiar with that house.
I visited the house, and his glass house is part of a bigger property, and on that property there's like half a dozen different architecture and big art installations, so it's sort of like a big playground for artists and architects in a certain sense. And the trip was great. Being part of a big property like that with all these different things happening is really cool, no doubt. I thought it was okay. I thought it was just everyone thinks this, basically a ripoff or a bad copy of what Mies would have done. And I recall when I was there, and unfortunately we don't have our own pictures for a lot of these things, so people have to Google it, but I felt like some of the details were pretty crappy and they didn't make sense. It
Was
looked
it
to
done
me,
after Farnsworth?
Oh, it must have been.
Right.
Philip Johnson glass house date. Built between 1950 and 1995? What does that mean?
Well, they completed in 1949. It probably got remodeled or added on later.
Oh, interesting. But the Farnsworth house took place about the same time. So it says here the Farnsworth house was built and completed after Philip Johnson's glass house.
No. No. It started in 46. The other one was done in 49.
Well, it started... Okay, fine. Well, nevertheless, Philip Johnson was influenced by a bunch of different architects because that's kind of... everyone knows this. And I felt like this house was either a cheap attempt at copying either the Farnsworth or one of other Mies's projects. And I recall it just felt like someone who's an architect hobbyist who didn't actually understand architecture was trying to do their version of something.
Oh, really?
It just didn't, there were things that just didn't make a whole lot of sense. And it was kind of annoying too, because it is a glass house. It's like the Farnsworth. There's glass on all four sides with some program in the middle, floating in the middle, and you circulate all around with an extreme open floor plan. So therefore, there's not many architectural details to the project. So for it to be not right, it's like, how do you mess that up? And like, you only have two details to worry about in this house, as opposed to houses these days with the criteria of keeping basically the nature out. You know, details are way more complex now, and an average house will have, I don't know, dozens of details. Well, it depends on the size and complexity, but dozens of details. How do you mess up having basically 3 details on a project?
Yeah.
But anyway, so the Farnsworth house, that's an interesting choice. I do really like Mies van der Rohe. I haven't, visited many of his projects. Like the Barcelona Pavilion, I've never been. Ooh, that's a good one too.
And I would love to. But there is something, I don't know, there is something that's very fascinating about his work, again, in like the simplicity of the element, but the extreme precision of the composition.
But don't you sometimes look at his work or this one, the Farnsworth house, and just feel like it's not doing enough, or that it's underwhelming because it's not really doing anything?
No. I mean, if I'm looking for a very simple, elegant, peaceful, precise building, like that would be, like probably one of the ideal one. If I'm looking for something different, then that's something different. Like, it's just, that was not his purpose. That's not what he's trying to do here.
I mean, I guess the thing I've always wondered with this, like, I would have never put this at the top of my list of favorite buildings. And not because I don't like the building or that it's a bad building, but because it's, and maybe my criteria for what makes a favorite building is different from yours, and there's no right or wrong with it. But it's kind of like, I don't really know what to do with this information beyond like, oh, that's cool. It's just, the house is for people who don't know, it's just one big room that's enclosed in glass on all 4 sides, a flat roof. And then there's a core in the center of the plan, more or less, that has like the bathroom, basically the plumbing core, the bathroom, the kitchen, and then there's a bed that's kind of attached to the side of that program core, and that's it. And I mean, it is interesting because it does, especially at that point in time, it's the extreme version of what a house is when it's in its fundamental components, right? And when you think about it, now we're so used to, well, even before this house and after this house and all throughout time in modern history, we think of houses as having, 6 or 10 different discrete separate rooms for different activities, and they have to be enclosed. And pre-modernism, those rooms were very, very enclosed. You had like a formal dining space. Yeah. The kitchen was super separate. Everything was separated. And then the open floor plan, quote, concept came around, and that changed a lot of things. And this is like the extreme example of that. And when you do think about a house, right, well, what are the actual core elements that have to be integrated into the house in order for it to be a modern house? Well, it's plumbing and electricity, and that's kind of it, right? Now, in this information age, there's a lot more that comes with electronics, but fundamentally, you just need plumbing, right? You need water to come into the house and water and waste to go out of the house, and you need electricity to be able to plug in to however many places you need to plug into, which is basically just an outlet, and therefore somewhere to, and then the rest of it, right? The plumbing therefore comes with a bunch of fixed elements like sinks that have to be next to the plumbing pipes, like toilets, like showers, dishwashers, perhaps. That's about it for the plumbing, right? And so it is interesting. Like, what happens if you take all that stuff and you just compact it, you put it in one spot, and then the rest of what makes a space, one could argue that it's not so much the 4 walls that makes a bedroom as much as it is the bed. And what makes a dining room is not so much the 4 walls around the dining room as much as it is the furniture, the dining room, the dining table, and the chairs. And that's basically what this project is. It's
basically the bare bones. Like, it's all you need. But it's done in a very elegant way. I was just looking at that image where the house is floating off the ground by probably 3-4 feet.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, like, why do we have crawl space? Like, why don't we have more houses that are just like on little short legs like this, and you can like have kids go and hide underneath and like see like bears, sleeping under your house? Like,
That's why.
Why do we need all the shit, that goes around it? And like why are we making construction more complicated than it needs to be? Sometimes, I wonder.
I think you brought up the reason, though. You don't want bears and kids going under there.
But so what? Yeah,
It's
I'm never going
conditioned-
to be under there. Like, the bear can go and sleep there at night. I don't care. I'm above in my bed and my duvet. Like, you know, like...
I mean, the other thing, too, is this house is raised by quite a bit. So there is proper space underneath. Most houses, their crawl spaces are not that big. So if you were to remove that part of the foundation that sticks above grade, it wouldn't be, it'd be a zone for basically raccoons to crawl under and die under. It's not raised enough in most houses to do what you're describing.
Well,
but I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. The other thing too with this house too is, it has to be mentioned because I think for non-architects, and I was talking to a real estate agent not long ago, and he was like, why isn't there more mid-century style developments happening in Los Angeles, for example? Like, these houses are so cool. A lot of people in California love them, the Eichler-esque or anything mid-century. Why are there not more spec houses that are like that? And because these houses were built really simply, post and beam structure, and structurally that's very, very simple. And he's like, I don't understand why don't we have more spec houses like that? And it's because they're more expensive than the spec houses that are being built now, just with the way that construction has evolved. And the other thing too, with a lot of the mid-century houses and the Farnsworth house, is that they do not meet today's criteria for code. I mean, this amount of glass would be considered very expensive if you were to do it today. You'd have double, or this is in Chicago, so not in Illinois, so you'd have at least double. I mean, I don't know how you could probably double or triple pane to get the energy, kind of efficiency. You'd have to have railings everywhere, which would destroy the look of this building if you had railings. It would be completely different if you added like a railing. It wouldn't be the same thing. So anyway, so what I was getting to is that it's easy for us all to look at older architecture, modern architecture even, and romanticize about it, and with good reason. But also there's the reality that you couldn't do this now. It wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, so is the code like, killing modern architecture? Probably.
I believe it is. It's too much. It's too much. I think it's like...
Like, how many people have fallen off that little entry deck? Probably one, because the person was stupid, right? Like, there is no reason to have a 42-inch railing unless, like, you're 3 years old and you don't know that if you're going to fall, you're going to hurt yourself. But if you're an adult... There's no reason. I
think there's also this sentiment in the United States, more so than other countries, that we have to be overly prescriptive to protect the users, but also, frankly, to protect the other people from someone falling. And instead of acknowledging, well, I was being stupid and I was drunk or I should have known better, that person was just going to sue you. Like,
that's what the US are famous for.
That's what we're known for. That's what happens. Yeah. And it is a good topic, though. I mean, it's a problem because... across many different industries, but in our industry of architecture, it's like, why do we have these things? It's because one person fell or did something. Yep. But I truly do believe that it's silly. It's if you can't use common sense in how to exist in a very safe environment that we have, again, in like modern history, that's your own problem. Like, don't let that become an issue for everybody else. So we always have to have this and that in every single house. It's insane, is what it is. So I'm all for, no railings. I don't want railings. No, I mean, of course we should have railings, but like it does get silly. Even this reminds me, there was a code change fairly recently where, not long ago, when kitchen islands started to become a much more prevalent thing in the past, 20, 30 years or whatever it was, people were using kitchen islands, and they found kitchen islands were great because they're an entertaining space. You can put out chips and dip. You can make food while people are standing across in the kitchen, and the kitchen became an entertaining space. And so, the kitchen island also becomes a great work surface. But if I'm doing anything that requires electricity, like blending stuff or mixing things, I need an outlet. Okay, outlets on the side of kitchen islands. Makes perfect sense. Well, guess what? Some half a dozen kids were running around the house, and because the outlet was on the side of the kitchen island, or in the kitchen island, they would hit the outlet and pull over the appliance, knocking over the appliance or whatever. So now outlets in kitchen islands have been banned. They're not allowed anymore, right? So as a result, what everyone does is...
Is it just in California, or is it statewide?
Good question. It might be just in California. I'm not sure. So now what everyone
stupid
does...
kid.
what everyone does is you build the island and you build all of the necessary infrastructure for an outlet, but you don't put it in there, and then you stick it in after the inspection is done, right? Because obviously having an outlet in a kitchen island makes perfect sense. And the ones that
Having
are
your
allowed...
kid in the kitchen doesn't. So
and the ones that are... rather, I should say that they outlets are still allowed in kitchen islands, but not on the sides. So you have to have ones on top, right? And they have those on the top
that's
surface.
Worse.
And they have ones that pop up, which always break. And then you got food and water going in there. Like, it just... But this is the type of thing, right? Like, why are we catering to the 1% of people who don't know how to live with common sense?
Yeah.
Like, instead of them learning to live with common sense, I don't know. Anyway, so when I see this house, that's my first thought is like, can't do that today.
Oh, of course. Yeah, no, of course.
The floor plan is so radical, though. I mean, if we, where is that image of it? It's funny because the floor plan is so much a vital tool of the architect, right? And for many architects, that's one of the most important drawings that we have to work with and to think through. Not for construction coordination, but for design. And obviously for construction, but I mean for design purposes. And so when you're in architecture school, supposedly you learn about how to draw on a floor plan, that's going away for some strange reason. But anyway, the floor plan is like this, a very important thing, right? You have to have a floor plan that looks good. It has to graphically look good, then the building will feel good. So you have to work out how all the rooms flow and the circulation and the views and all that stuff. And this floor plan there's like 10 lines in the floor plan. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about like, I don't know, a dozen lines in this floor plan.
Yeah.
I would have never thought that you would have chosen this as one of the three.
Oh, again, those are all houses that I love. If they're my, lifetime favorite, I don't know. But there is something that's very fascinating to me with this house. And so it is.
Is it because, for me, it's interesting because it really is a demonstration. First, it is an actual house that was built for a client. Their relationship between Mies and I think it was Mrs. Farnsworth there was a lot of drama there, but it's an actual house. It's not just an experimental thing. But for me, it's a demonstration of a critique of what our preconceived notions are of houses.
Of course.
And obviously, glass on all sides is not for everybody. Obviously, though, they're in a very secluded area, so it kind of works.
She was probably living naked in this house.
There was something to do with nudity also in their relationship. I forget what it was exactly.
Really? Oh, I see.
It's an odd thing that some clients, some people are willing to just let go of preconceptions.
Oh, it's very radical. It's crazy that a client would hire an architect and agree to live in a house that's like that, And it's almost like, well, not who came up with the idea, but like, who was pushing who? Like, was the client pushing the architect to design something like way out of the box and way different than like the typical expectation? Or was the architect seeing that client could be the type to live in a house that is completely radically different from the typical house?
Yeah, again, there's a lot of story with that relationship between the two of them. I just don't remember what it was. It's also, I don't know.
The other thing too is that this house actually doesn't even could be not a house.
In what regard?
Well, this house is a house because of the furniture that are put in them. But if you remove the furniture, you just populate it with desk.
Yeah.
Or you populate it with music instruments, or you have, easels and tables and tools. It becomes a complete different space.
Well, I think that's also part of what a lot of Mies van der Rohe was doing with his work was, in a certain sense, the space for him was sort of universal blank open space. The space itself, doesn't have any inherent characteristics or program. It's just space. And so therefore I think a lot of his efforts really went toward the architecture, meaning the physical stuff and the details and the simplicity and the complexity and simplicity of how those details and how there's this phrase like no one turns a corner like me, because he studied how the corners of buildings, like as a study, as a thing to investigate, as a thing to spend time on, is just the corner of buildings, or how a column or a post meets a roof, and just to looking at that thing. He has decoration in his buildings for sure. Like the Seagram building has, I believe, they're vertical like I-beams that are basically glued to the facade. But anyway, so it's an interesting point that this structure could be used for anything, because it's not.
It's just a canvas. It's just a blank canvas, a platform, which is very interesting, which is even more minimal in the way you think about
a house.
You think about a house, you think about a building. It was not designed, it seems like, necessarily on the premises that this has to be used as a house.
Possibly. I mean, I think that also goes back to the question of what makes architecture. It's presumably that we have to enclose space to keep the elements out, so we're protected from the rain and the cold. And I mean, single pane glazing doesn't really protect you from the cold, but we're enveloped and we're protected. Okay, you do that, and then the function basically, just aside from the core, just comes from the furniture. So I think that's also why I find it so strange when people want to divorce furniture and interior program from the architecture. I'm like, well, that's not really, that idea that these are separate things and they're different professions and whatever is a very narrow-minded view of what it means to have architecture as a human species that's based on one's vision of the last 10 or 15 years of time. Like, I think this is going to sound probably arrogant, but I think that's also like one of the differences when I talk to a lot of different people, a lot of architects, a lot of architectural educators and historians and practicing architects of all different kinds. And then a lot of non-architects, obviously. And that's like one of the biggest differences when I'm talking to these two groups, architects and non-architects, that I see and I feel is architects think about their work in this this historic lens. Not that they were all claiming to be a Mies van der Rohe, but we understand the work from this very primitive, basic standpoint of we create shelter, and then there's a bunch of other layers on top of that. Whereas I think people who were not educated in architecture or don't practice it, they don't see those layers. It's all kind of like mashed up to being the same, but it's not. Like this is as much architecture as it is anything else, and it is as much interiors as it is anything else. It's just not what everyone perceives as being these things based on, again, their 15-year span where they exist now, and they happen to be existing in the years 2020 or so. That's not really how, but that's not architecture.
I know.
Yeah. All right, this is a good one. I'm enjoying this. Okay, hit me with your second favorite building.
So the second one, I honestly, it's probably more about the architect's work than one of his specific building. So the second one might be actually, two of them. I'm probably missing another one. Maybe three even. I don't know.
You are taking so long.
Okay, the second one, they're kind of like, there's kind of two. There's kind of two of the second one. It would be either Falling Water.
Okay.
Which I have to say, I wasn't particularly a fan of the interiors.
Okay.
But that view in the forest was kind of like...
The view of the outside, the building, the one that you see everywhere.
It's just you know, who did that, you know? Yeah. And so basically Frank Lloyd Wright's work. I mean, Falling Water is pretty iconic, and I think like his buildings, that's probably the one that strikes me the most when I saw it, was like, wow, like the wow effect when you look at it. Again, the interiors, like there's things I don't necessarily care about so much. I do love the level of details and design and intricacies, and it's almost like you want to spend like hours in there, like scrutinizing every single detail and understanding like everything that's been put in it. And I cannot imagine how many hours of work and construction and drawings, were probably put into building the buildings that he did. So yeah.
Was that your building though, or you were going to?
It was, well, there was kind of two. There was this one, but mostly for the exterior. Again, the interior wasn't probably like my favorite of his.
Mm-hmm.
The second contender to the second favorite building would be the Johnson Wax building.
Yeah, nice.
So still Frank Lloyd Wright, just completely different approach. And actually the Johnson Wax would be for the interiors more than the exterior. So if we could put Johnson Wax inside Falling Water, then that would be my favorite.
Okay.
There was something kind of magical when we got the tour of this building, and
the Johnson Wax building.
Yeah, and I think we might have mentioned that before, like how we got to see it.
Yeah, it was a while ago. You tell the quick story. Yeah.
So I think it was it the same trip we saw Farnsworth?
Yes.
It might have been, right?
Yes. I remember because I was out of the office for a family emergency. Yeah. Okay.
So I think we ended up like last minute. We had missed the architecture. Was it the architecture biennale that happens in Chicago or something? There was like a architecture event tour over the weekend, and we just had found out. We happened to be in Chicago and kind of like missed it. And Johnson Wax building was on the list of buildings to tour during one of those events. So we ended up last minute, seeing that we could do the tour on Sundays or something, rented a car, drove over to Wisconsin just to go see that building. Mm-hmm. And we got to the gate, and the gate was closed, and there was no one around, and that just doesn't look like good news, right? You're like, I think we messed up here.
Yeah.
Speak to the guard. We're trying to explain, there is a tour. We're here for the tour. And the guy's like, there's no tour. There's no one here. Nobody's working today. And we're like, what? And he nicely ended up calling someone who actually probably felt so bad for us that we rented a car, drove, and made it all the way to kind of like hit a wall. That person gave us a very quick tour of the building. So it was like the main office administration building, and I think it was the lab building, that skinny tower, which was really cool. So we didn't really get to like spend a whole lot of time there, but it was enough time that I remember when he opened the door of the...
It was a she.
Or she opened the door of the administration buildings, and seeing like those, mushroom columns and the light hitting it, and like
they're the lily pads.
Well, whatever.
They're referred to as lily pads, I think.
Sure, lily pads if you want. It was just magical, like the way the light was in that space. It like, sometimes you go into church, and even if you're not religious, like you kind of get that feeling of wowness and kind of like admirative silence of the space. It kind of felt that way, but I'm like, this is an office building. So it was kind of weird to get this similar feeling in the space that's just meant to be a space where you work. Yeah. So there was something pretty magical. The furniture was still, like the original or replicas of the original, which was pretty cool. Like it just felt like you traveled in time in some ways. It almost felt like a Wes Anderson set,
the colors,
like the colors, the lights, the aesthetic of that time.
If he hasn't done a movie inside the building, that's a great pairing, though.
Yeah,
Johnson Wax building plus Wes Anderson would be a lot of fun.
That would be, that's almost too perfect, actually. So I think that would be my second favorite too.
It was definitely one of the structures where you enter it and there's that wow moment. Mm-hmm. You can't not have a wow moment. And what I think I like about this building, and a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, but this building is a good example of it, is that he was really pushing the boundaries. He wanted to do this office, create this office structure, and he wanted to have these very slender columns that would come down to a very small point. And the engineers, the construction team and the client, like no one believed that could be done.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, you're crazy. You're an arrogant, crazy person, which he was both of those things. And it's not going to work. It's not going to work. So they actually did a mock-up of one of the columns, and it held something like 10 times its weight that was needed to before it buckled. And, by today's standards, when I see the columns, I'm like, I don't see why this is an issue. You have a shit ton of columns, but maybe it was different back then. I'm not sure. Also, it's just a roof load. It's not a live load. I mean, it's not a floor above it. But there, I like his work so much for so many reasons. But one of them is that there's a really strong sense of experimentation in a lot of his projects, and the experimentation takes place in actual buildings, which has to do with Frank Lloyd Wright. It also has to do with the times and the clients and many other factors, but it takes place in the building. So I think the ceiling or the roof of the structure is made of like glass tubes or something, and it's not waterproofed correctly, so water would leak. That's a very kind of famous story that even the owner or the CEO or president of the company would keep a trash bin next to his desk so it could catch, water as it would fall from the roof. The lab tower, which sits more or less on just one giant column in the middle, which doesn't make any sense at all. Its facade is also made of,
Pyrex
tubes, which I don't know if conceptually or a narrative was and meant to tie into the lab nature of the laboratory. I imagine it would, but it also, it doesn't make sense as a facade in terms of like building performance at all. I assume they caulked or silicone like the gaps between them to try and make it weather tight, which doesn't work. So, but there's just experimentation, and therefore, like you get the sense that in a lot of his work, there are definitely moments in his work where it's perfect. Like you can't touch it. It's somehow the gods came down and they allowed him to create the perfect thing in certain moments, like falling water from the outside. Don't touch that. Don't touch that. Don't tweak it. If you were in an office, you're designing it and you're working on it and you did that and a partner came by, don't do anything more. Don't add another piece. Don't raise it by an inch. Just leave it alone. And his work has a lot of those qualities in throughout. But the work also throughout all of his projects has this edge to it because he's trying things that don't quite work for construction reasons or sometimes design reasons. They're a little bit sloppy. The relationship between two different components, just kind of a weird relationship filled with friction, but it's okay. And what I like about that is it reminds me of in music, you can play a piece that's perfect. You're hitting every note perfect. You're in tune. You're dead center in the note. You're in sync with the metronome. It's all perfect. But the music that has a little bit of edge to it, where things get a little bit out of control, because someone's trying something. You can tell the guitars, whoever, they're trying something. That's really what we should be doing. And Frank Lloyd Wright's work, and a lot of other architects, but his work, that's what resonates. That's what's exciting to me. It's like he's trying something.
Well, I think that's also what made him not famous, but well known.
Yeah. Like
if you just do basic stuff and that what's expected, like nobody's gonna care. You're not pushing anything anywhere.
Yeah. And I think that is one of the challenges we have as architects now, because the building codes, the zoning, the planning, the construction technologies have all become more sophisticated and more complex, that so much of our time has to go toward that. And it's easy to let that kind of consume more than it should in the effort. Because it's hard to do a building that meets all those criteria and just do that. Like it's enough work just to do that. Forget about design that looks good or is great or is forget all that stuff. It's hard enough just to do a building. And but that's not it's not life. That's not exciting.
Yeah.
Wes Anderson should do a movie in this building just so we could see it from his lens and through different angles and stuff like that.
What was crazy too with this building is the scale, and actually going from falling water to this is pretty interesting, because falling water, you feel very squished inside the architecture. Like it's very tight. It's very flat. You're really like within the burger layers of the house, right?
Yeah.
Where in this space, it's almost like you feel like a teeny tiny person because the height of the space is gigantic, and those lily pad columns really make you feel. It made me feel like we were outside, but we were inside a building, which was super interesting. They also had like a second, I think, or and third story on the perimeter, so you can
like a mezzanine level.
So you can walk around the whole perimeter of the building and still look at this office courtyard, office jungle, which is very interesting.
It's a strange thing because this was done by Frank Lloyd Wright, one of the greatest architects. So he's at a different tier than everyone else, But this building is not inherently that much more complex than an average building. I mean, it's more complex in its design, but it's still just, concrete and steel and carpet and some metal for a rail. Like, it's not anything. He's not using titanium. He is using Pyrex water tubes for a facade, which is pretty wacky, but it's not, when you're in the space, it's not like you're in there thinking, wow, this is made of like, asteroid material. That's why it's good. It's not that. And it makes me think again, why don't we have more buildings that are just better? And the difference between this building and let's say another office building, aside from the Pyrex, is that like the client or someone, the client spent money on an architect to think about it and actually think about like, what can we do for a building that makes sense and pushes the boundary, and whatever else was going through Frank Lloyd Wright's mind, instead of being, let's just do it cheap as fast as possible and maximize square footage. And I need to prioritize market resale value. And, I need to make sure I have this many outlets. Having X number of outlets and X number of desks, of course, that's part of the program. But
I think the value system has changed, since. I think people back then valued things very differently than we value things now. And I think that ultimately impacts our profession, for example.
Yeah, I'm sure there's always people at that point in time too who prioritize the things I mentioned, but it's weird, right? Because the physical stuff and the amount of space that the building occupies is not necessarily more. So like what gives here? Like why not do stuff like this more often? I don't mean copying the lily pads, but why not do buildings like this more often? And I think also this reminds me that it doesn't necessarily take a whole lot more construction budget to do a good building. That's not the case. I think the challenge is that I think mostly of houses, of course, that because things are so expensive to build, that to spend, I don't know, it's just the finances are hard when it comes to construction, but also having a fee for an architect, at least in the client's mind. But again, like architect's fees between 10 and 20, 15% or whatever is, as a percentage, is a relatively small thing. But you can gain something like this for 5% more of construction costs, 10% more of construction costs. Is it worth it? Well, in the grand scheme of why we exist on this planet and what we're doing, it's beyond worth it. We're going to make more crappy buildings for us to live in and have other people have to live in and work in. That doesn't make sense.
Well, I'm glad you're the one doing most of the talk about my favorite building.
So with this building, though, one of the aspects that I found quite odd and was a bit, it was sloppy and it was not really resolved well, is if you remember, when you enter, you first see the tower, I think, and then you walk around the tower, and there's an exterior procession into the building, and it's basically a covered walkway with water-featured ponds on either side, and the lily pad gesture is basically makes the columns of that walkway, so it's like an arcade. But it felt like someone took the language of the inside and stuck it on the outside and then truncated the columns. And they also ended weird at the building. They didn't like flow into it, but they just kind of stopped. And then I recall also at that point, or maybe inside the building, A few of the lily pads like hit corners in kind of a weird spot too, so they just get kind of chopped, as a wedge.
There's only so many hours they could finish the project in. So,
but that's also why, like, I don't care that entry was a bit odd to me. Like, who cares, right? And I think there's also this nature in architects to be perfectionists with what we do.
Yeah, tell me about it.
And especially, I think that perfectionist quality of a person can neatly tie into the technical aspects of architecture and perfecting details and making sure everything aligns perfectly and in the design and in the details and all the stuff. And, that's important, of course, but at some point, you gotta, like, it. Again, I feel like it's music. You have to let it live and breathe, and you can't be over controlling in the final composition of the thing.
So I'm gonna save this little soundbite, and I'm gonna play it to you when you're working on details for too long. I'm gonna be like, listen to this, David.
No. The details have to be right.
Right. So do what I said.
But that's a balancing act that we have to do, right? Is between those two things. Again, going back to music, one of the ensembles I was a part of was a classical wind orchestra, and wind orchestra meaning there was no string instruments, but we played classical music. It wasn't jazz, it wasn't rock and roll, it was classical music. And we had this, call him a guest director, come in and direct the group. And he directed a piece that we had been practicing and rehearsing for several months. So we knew it really well. And we were pretty good at this. It was a complex piece, but we're pretty good at it. And and we got to this one segment where the song shifted from, it wasn't light and it wasn't elegant. It was much more of a, not carnival, but kind of like it had a good beat. It had some kind of angst to it. Like, that was the nature of the song. But we had been used to playing it more true to what was written on the page, like playing the notes and being in tune and being in sync and all that stuff. And what I always remember was really fascinating is he was like, we're going to go back and play the section again, but I want you to follow my rhythm that I'm conducting, and I want you to play it out of tune. I think it was the clarinet section, play it out of tune. And we're like, what? You want us to play offbeat and out of tune? What, are you crazy? That's not what we do. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. And we did it. And at first it sounded just weird, but then we did it a few times with them, and then the song took on a completely different meaning and sensation to it, because we were leaning into the emotion of the piece and letting that drive the decision making of how we perform it, rather than being a bit more buttoned up about the performance and hitting everything perfectly. So clarinets were out of tune, we were lagging behind the actual beat, we were just behind it. And it was great. It came much more alive. We had to dial it back a little bit for the actual performance, but I will never forget that, because it was a clear distinction between, you could do it right, in quotes, or you could do it how it's meant to be. And they're not always the same thing.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Yeah, no, I mean, well, I feel like for music it's easier maybe to do that, because you get the result of your experimentation as you're performing.
Yeah.
In architecture, it's much more complicated, because you can sketch, you can 3D model, you can make physical model as much as you want, but you really won't test it until the thing is built.
That's true. Well, there's a lot more at stake too, right?
It's a bit more of a complicated process.
There's a lot at stake. The buildings cost a lot of money, take a lot of time, and so there's the need or the temptation to like make everything perfect. But I think if we take that analogy and apply it just to the design of a building, I think it's like I do feel like some modern architects, they just want everything to align and be perfect and make perfect logical sense. But sometimes things don't have to make perfect sense. They exist just for the sake of beauty, and they don't have any program attached to it. They're not perfectly aligned with that thing over there. They fall where they fall to feel right, and that's it. and let it go. Like stop fussing with it and be like, why is it this way? Why is it that way? Why? And that's with architects. I also find it too with clients in general who, rightfully so, are concerned, let's say kitchens, which are easy to pick on, like the golden triangle. We got to have the golden triangle for efficiency. We must have this. We must have that. We have all of these things and know why, where's the storage and where's that? All these like functional aspects, and the design must optimize all of these things. It's like, but it does to a degree, but Farnsworth House, right? Like it doesn't need to be that.
There is two dishes in the kitchen.
It could be a glass box. Like you don't need it. And that's where the poetry of, I think, architecture comes from. So yeah.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to the client too. Like, to some clients you can't even get past that golden triangle.
It also comes down to, I think, the personalities of the clients and things like that too.
Of course. And sometimes, in the opposite way, sometimes clients like to be challenged. And if you don't try, you never know if they are the type to be challenged or not.
No, of course, absolutely. Yeah.
So I mean, probably Johnson Wax would maybe top over Falling Water in some ways. And now a quick break to thank the sponsors who support the second studio.
Hey architects, would you like to get your as-built faster? Of course you would. Well, IPX has you covered. IPX lets you seamlessly transform your laser scans into LOD 300 BIM and CAD files. Whether you've got your 3D scans already or you need a full laser scanning service, IPX offers instant pricing and order tracking for scan to BIM services on any project, no matter the size or complexity. Once a building scan is complete, IPX delivers detailed BIM, CAD, 360-degree virtual tours, and material takeoffs in their platform where you can view, share, export, query, and quantify areas, floors, and materials. Check out the IPX link in our show notes. The Second Studio podcast is sponsored by Autodesk. Do you know about Autodesk Forma? Available standalone or as part of their AEC Collection software bundle, it's a specialized AI-assisted 3D design tool that can transform early project planning. With Forma, you can rapidly model multiple massing options at the start of your projects and analyze the embodied carbon costs of different volumes, layouts, and material choices. You can then deepen your understanding of your sites by incorporating real-world contextual data for daylight, wind, noise, and more. Start your projects right with Autodesk Forma. Check out the link in our show notes to learn more.
If you're an interior designer, you need to check out Programma. Programma is the all-in-one project management software designed to streamline the entire design process. Its cloud-based specification schedules are always up to date, minimizing double handling. This means you can spend less time switching between tools and more time designing. Click the Programma link in our episode notes and use the code SecondStudio at checkout to save 25% on an annual subscription and enjoy exploring all of the other tools Programma offers.
All right, hit us with your third one.
Okay, so the third one, I don't know. Okay, well, there is kind of, again, like two in a similar position. One would be the Pompidou Center.
Oh, nice.
Because it's kind of a bold.
That's a brave choice.
It's bold and unexpected. And I would say maybe in a similar way, the Unité by Corby.
Oh, okay.
And I'm kind of like jumping in scales here, and from minimal to more playful stuff. But the Pompidou Center, I've been there a few times when I was living in Paris. I also studied it in different classes and projects and looked at it in more details. And it's, again, I don't know, maybe it's like I like the framework of the architecture itself. And maybe that's where Wright is maybe like my choices on Wright's work is a little bit different. But actually all of those, let's say, buildings that we've talked about so far, they're very much about the platform and how people use it and technical aspects combined with rational and poetic. And maybe that's the commonalities between all of them. This one is just ridiculous because if you've ever been to Paris and you've ever been to the center of Paris where this is located, it just doesn't belong there. It's like a spaceship building, and it's probably a building that most people who are not architects would despise because it is not attractive to most people's standards. It looks industrial. It looks like there is a bunch of mechanical stuff coming up on the facade. The colors are kind of aggressive.
It's also
it looks like a giant scaffolding.
It's also a big block. Like
And the
it's
scale
basically
does
one
not
big
make
cube.
sense. The scale does not make sense. And on the other side of the street, you have those beautiful Osmanian, Parisian buildings with decors and scales and little windows and sensibilities. And this is just completely ignoring everything that's around, which is kind of like why I like the building.
That's a bold choice to say this as your third one. I'm glad you did, because this crossed my mind when I was thinking of a selection, and I didn't choose it, but you did, so it kind of relieves me. It's
I like because it's a provocation, and it's and in a way it makes complete sense in this case because it is a museum of modern art. So it's almost like, what would you expect a museum of modern art to do as a building? And you would expect it to make a statement and provoke people in the place where it takes place, and that's exactly what they're doing. And again, they're not really like, bringing on a bunch of decoration or like pieces of design just for the sake of being like flashy or cool. Like, they're using integral part of the system and the puzzle. And they're just, again, like I think it's been written about it, like they're kind of like exposing the guts of the building on the facade, and that's what makes the facade.
Yeah. There are, for sure, though, plenty of the, quote, guts on the exterior that are there just for visual presence.
Yeah,
of
course.
Unless they were trying to power, like, all of Paris with this thing, or vent all of Paris. A lot of it's just there for aesthetics.
So yeah, I think this building is brilliant.
And I think the inside too is exactly what it needs to be. It's hyper flexibility for museum space, which is what you want in a museum. And it's what's interesting about your three choices. So we had, what was the first one? The Farnsworth House, Johnson Wax building.
So I said Johnson Wax. I mean, flowing water it's really just that view that I cherish.
That's fair. Yeah. That is actually, on that, it's weird because when you have buildings that are so famous that the general public knows falling water, which is phenomenal, right? The idea that if you say falling water to the almost average American, they're probably going to know.
Or if you show them the photo, they'll
be like, I know that, which is crazy. And for a house in particular, like, it's crazy. It's not a big tower in the middle of it's not the Eiffel Tower. It's like, it's a house. But when something like that exists and it becomes that famous, and then architects also study it and realize its value. So it's not just a pulp culture, like, oh, it's the latest scandal between, I don't know, Britney Spears or whatever. That's why they're all known. It's not that. Like, it's also actually legitimately a brilliant piece of architecture. Yeah. When you have that, it distorts reality about this thing. And that's always my concern when I go see projects that are well known or I've studied them, is what are my preconceptions because I've studied them when I come to the thing. But I truly feel like, as objectively as I could be, when you turn the corner in the forest and you see that view of falling water, you just think, fuck, man. There it is. And it's exactly as it is in the photographs, but even better because it's real. And it doesn't make any sense. It is a very strange thing. And also, I think because you've seen that image so many times, it's very bizarre. It's one of the few buildings where when you see it from that view, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
But then you see another side of it and you're like, oh, no, that's good.
There's a lot of funky moments in that house. But okay, so we had the Farnsworth, Johnson and Wax in this building. What's interesting about all three of the buildings you've chosen is that all three are the utmost clearest expression of what they were intended to be and wanted to be. Mm-hmm. So the idea behind the project is exactly what the project is, and there's no messing about. There's no, well, I think we should do that because of whatever, appeasing that audience or this person. Or, well, museums don't really look this way, or museums are supposed to be white or whatever.
They're supposed to be quiet so the art could speak. And,
exactly. Or a house is supposed to feel cozy. And these are all fundamentally they're just preconceptions. And I think for a designer and an architect, something that is a preconception, period. It doesn't matter if it's a little one or a big one, or if it's common or uncommon, it's still a preconception. So all bets are off when it comes to designing something. So whether it be that, a house should feel cozy, or that a room must have 4 walls, or whatever it is, it means nothing to me. That sounds harsh, but it means nothing to me. All the stuff, it means nothing to me. And this museum, I mean, when they did this museum, they were young and they didn't think they were going to win because it was so radical. But it's exactly what it needs to be, and it was when it was intended to be. It's a miracle the project got built.
Yeah, no, and I mean, if you look at pictures, just seeing all the bits and parts of it, again, it's like...
It must cost a fortune. It does cost a fortune to maintain this thing every year. Like, how much of their budget goes to
probably
maintenance?
Not super well maintained. but even construction-wise, like, there is a lot of parts, even the structural system, again, like, was an invention. Like, they invented the system of, piers and
cross-bracing?
Trusses. That specific detail on the edges that cantilevers out, and that, this connection and all of that was invented for that building.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of work that's been put in that, which is...
Yeah, I mean, Richard Rogers, you can see a lot of his work has similarities when he was alive, and his offices still exist. And, I mean, it's also a really great example of when architects have the freedom and time and the fee to spend time inventing new details and thinking about and interrogating details you can produce. I mean, Sugar a Bond is a great example, but with wood generally. I mean, this building doesn't exist unless someone spends time on the details.
Yeah, and this building doesn't exist if a client, is letting the architect dream a little bit the way they want to dream about it. There
should be a documentary or something that studies the relationships between architects and clients, because the two go hand in hand. They're like not two peas in a pod. They're like best friends. If you don't have your best friend or your sister with you, you don't function as an architect. You need that other person.
Then how many of these, successful and well-known buildings are because of that relationship?
Yeah.
It comes from the talent of the architect, but it also comes from the client trusting that talent or pushing that talent and believing in it, and that's a huge part of making it happen.
It would also be interesting to see how many of the great modern works of architecture were produced and that relationship was crap and the client was not happy with how it turned out and the budget went over.
Oh, all of them, probably.
Because, and I'm not saying that we should ever aim to do that. Of course not. But I think that it does sort of point to that for some architects, their radical vision is just too much for obviously most people and too much for even radical clients. And you don't get certain projects without someone being upset or something not going quote according to plan, because the plan is not designed. The plans, I don't mean the construction plans, but like the plan for the project, the schedule, all that stuff, like that doesn't exist. No one creates a budget for most of the time creates a budget and a schedule for a project that will allow for this thing or the other two build. Like that doesn't work, right? Because these structures, they're past the normal they're in a different stratosphere of existence, not because of quality, but because they're artworks. They're not, the rules that they abide by and what they're trying to do has nothing to do with standard stuff. And standard stuff also applies to standard expectations for budgets and schedules, which is a horrible thing to say if clients are listening to this, but it's an interesting thought, but this building is, it's very brave for the French to do something like this, but the French have historically not been shy because they've done things like this a few times, including the Louvre.
Yeah, and I mean, any type of project like this was received with not great responses. It's just over time people maybe got too learn what it was and what it was trying to do and appreciate it for that.
The funny thing is, even now, I'm sure if you were to take a poll of people in Paris who walked by this building, fairly often and ask them, what do you think about it?
I'm sure my parents hate that building.
Okay, there you go.
They've been there.
Yeah.
I'm sure they hate it. They're probably like, what is this? It looks awful. Because again, it doesn't conform to the norm of beauty, or what makes a building successful is what, to a lot of people is what makes it beautiful. And there are two different things.
But see, that's also what I'm saying too earlier, is my point is that first of all, what people equate their preferences for certain aesthetics with the true idea of beauty. And those are not the same thing. Because you like something which is based on, again, your point in time of existence of around 30 years of adult life or whatever, that does not mean that you are an expert in being able to say something's beautiful or not beautiful. I reject that wholly. I don't believe it. So there's that. But then also, like, even forget all that kind of conceptual theory, whatever pompous talk about beauty. You're right. Most people would walk by this building and be like, it's ugly. They might not say it's not beautiful, I know what beauty is, but they say it's ugly, it doesn't fit in, it's this and that. They're right, it doesn't fit in. But it's the criteria for critiquing an architecture from the layman's perspective is not adequate enough to actually have it be valid. This is the same thing, though. And again, I've said many things on this podcast. I'm going to sound arrogant, but it's the same thing, though, when you talk about any art form.
Yeah.
Film, architecture, art, painting, sculpture. There is a reason why it's a study and a profession, and there's a reason why that all of humankind across history, there's been people fascinated with these things. It's because there's something there. It's not always explainable as easily as other things, as 2 + 2 is 4. I can tell, that's right there in front of me. But it does exist, and so it's just It's also goes back to preconceptions, though, right?
Yeah. Well, I think also there is, always been something in society where anything that is industrial or utilitarian is not possibly beautiful.
That's a really good point.
It's just not. It always has to be emotional, poetic. It always has to fall in a certain genre.
Yeah.
To therefore be possibly beautiful, and if it's out of that genre, there's no chance. And why is that,
That is a really, really, really good point. And that's also...
And I think that's what makes us different, architects from maybe the general public, is that we have the understanding that beauty could happen in multiple genres. And when you are dealing with clients, oftentimes they are victims of those preconceptions.
Sure.
And they are limited in the genre that they can see beauty in.
Right. Right. Yeah. And look, of course... an office or a museum is a very different thing from a house. If it's a house, someone has to live in the thing and be there every day for the next 30 years. So no one's trying, and if it's their primary house, no one, including us, is trying to force on them this like alternate definition of beauty. They're like, yeah, but I don't want to live in what looks like a big rock. Like, if you don't want that, then you don't want that. It's fine. But as a whole, when we talk about critiquing architecture and understanding architecture and what makes it valid, it has very little to do with what you were describing. The idea of genre is an idea that it needs to conform to something. Needs to conform to one of these genres in order for it to be beautiful, or conform to a certain palette or certain whatever it is for it to be beautiful. It made me think back to museums, right? When you think about a museum, you think white. That's the first thing you think of is white and cleanliness and whatever else. And if it's a modern museum of art, then maybe it's white, but it has some angles to it. Ooh, angles makes it more edgy and modern. That's a complete rejection and not caring at all about these ideas of what a museum should be. And that's why it's great, and that's why it's brilliant. That's why it's amazing it got built. I also like your point, though, that industrial elements are typically thought of as being aesthetically undesirable, but also just distasteful, ugly things in their inherent nature and their spirit. which I also don't believe is
No.
a valid preconception. It's false. And we've gone over the hour, so I'll kind of, my last point and thought with this is that this even extends to how we perceive places and people and structures at the city scale, right? We do not like seeing waste facility plants. We do not like seeing again, anything industrial, water treatment plants. No, we can't have them in near the city center. We can't have it near this neighborhood because this is a bougie neighborhood. I'm actually thinking back to New York City. There's a long history of a wastewater treatment plant on the west side that was debated between, where it should go. It was to be located in the Upper West Side, and then it got kicked around to like 6 different locations because politically it didn't look good to have a wastewater treatment facility in certain neighborhoods. So where they punted to? Harlem. Why? Well, you can guess why it got punted to Harlem, because no one cared about Harlem, because it was where the poor black community was, and it was more acceptable to stick it there rather than in the rich, wealthy white areas, which is messed up. Fundamentally, it's also messed up because I think it's based on a disbelief, a false belief about what wastewater treatment facility plants are doing. Those and other industrial things are vital, critical parts of a city, of buildings. And the fact we're so afraid to show them is, I think, an extension of our deep, deep misunderstanding of mistruthfulness of like what it actually means to exist. We gotta clean the water. We gotta filter the ugly stuff. We have to deal with the coal, with the energy, whatever it is. Like, that's part of life. And the fact that we can't face it, I think is an example of a deeper, severe misunderstanding of life. It's not
Well,
honest.
they're trying to live in like a fantasy bubble of only good things, and there's nothing wrong with seeing like, again, the guts on buildings and seeing like how things work.
Yeah. And of course, there are legitimate health hazards sometimes with these facilities. That's different. And actually, on that subject of the wastewater treatment facility that I was describing in New York City, which I think was back in this was debated in New York City, and it took place over the span of like 30 years, a long time. So, it bounced around again between 12 different places, and the city really, really needed it. And so,
Of course,
when they put it up into, I think it was in Harlem, it was somewhere, and then there was an outcry because it was like, why are you sticking it in my neighborhood? They hired Philip Johnson, the guy who did the glass house, and his solution was to put a bunch of water fountains on top of the facility to make it into basically a spectacle. So you could look at look at the water fountains going off, like at the Bellagio. And this was met with not great feedback, because it was basically, okay, so you're taking something that, if we accept it as being undesirable, is undesirable, and you're dressing it up with superfluous water features to appease a poor neighborhood, where at that time, like, New York was a very different place. It wasn't poor like, oh wow, I have a tiny apartment. It's poor as in it's hard to feed yourself. And your solution for making this thing more desirable or whatever else is to decorate it with water being wasted and shooting up into the air. So that was shut down. I think ultimately it became a park with facilities and baseball fields and other stuff on top, which is a community thing, which is fantastic. Anyway, the point about industrial elements, forget aesthetics, is an interesting one. It's so, the thing I like about the Pompidou Center too is that it really says, from, if you could categorize all of the French together, as a city and Paris, it's like they understand the city. It is mostly historic, but they're not afraid to have giant scale works of art in the city, and the city is therefore kind of thought about not as being this overly controlling, oppressive thing. Although I do feel Paris is that way because a lot of it's historic. But like, we're gonna have this in the middle of Paris.
This is one in a few. I do feel like there is other European countries that are better, much more open-minded in doing stuff like that. Like any
Copenhagen,
any like
Denmark,
northern countries usually have a much more Yeah, just much more open arms to those types of things than probably French or anything
true.
below that would do. But there is a few. I mean, the Quai Branly by Jean Nouvel was also kind of like
absolutely
a big one. I wouldn't say it was that good, but like it was also trying to do something that's different. But this building is very appreciated by a lot of people now, the Pompidou, also because of all of the urban social life and activity that happens around it. Like it's a magnet for people and things to happen. It's not just a building.
We would be remiss if we didn't also mention or talk about that in front of the Pompidou Center, as I believe it was part of their design proposal, meaning to say that it was created by the architects. There is a massive plaza that's all cobblestone or concrete, I forget, that's in front of the Pompidou. That's a giant public space.
Yeah, and if my memory is correct, the building happened because I think there was a big fire in that area in Paris. And so they had to rebuild something. And I think that's why there is, there's a big plaza and a big building, because a lot of buildings were gone.
It's a wonderful work of architecture.
And I love that it's also
is.
right next to like a church around the corner that's like, typical French church. Like the juxtaposition of architecture styles and periods of time, I think is very fascinating. Like it's really like if you go in cities that have those different types of architecture, like you're basically traveling in time everywhere you walk, which is fascinating. You're jumping into like the 1990s or 2000s, and then back in like the 1500, and then you're back into like now time. I mean, it's pretty incredible.
And I think it's fine. It's fine to do that. I mean, I don't know if you want an entire city that way, but I think it's totally fine to have that juxtaposition. And a lot of times too, as architects and for the general public, we think about a new building that's going to be designed and built, and you want it to work with the context. But that, there's a lot of valid kind of thinking that comes with that train of thought, and a lot of productive architecture and positive architecture. But sometimes I also feel that this attempt to work with the surroundings too much is counterproductive. It's an itch. So like, if you have to do a building in a historic area, and let's say it's, you have, what do you call it? I'm blanking now, but it's a building that's squished between two buildings. So there's not space around it.
Infill?
Yeah, infill. And the building on your left and your right are both historic, and they're both, let's imagine they're 5-story buildings. We can imagine a classical structure on both sides, right? It's easy for everyone to picture. And you're doing a 6-story building or a 7-story building or a 5-story building smack between the two that's going to be glued up all the way next to those two on the left and the right. Very common for architects is to create something that's new and modern and contemporary, but also pays an homage or works with the buildings around it. So what you do is you carry over the datum. So the floor plate heights, those lines that exist in the two classical buildings, which are basically identical, you carry those across. You do certain things in the composition. So there's kind of like, it's very common for either the fundamental geometry that's underneath the facade of the design structure of the facade follows the same order as the buildings on the left or the right. That's one tactic. And or you employ the same materials as the left and the right, but you do a different type of composition. And that's like what everyone does. And I'm not saying it's wrong or bad, but I also think like, it's like, but you're just making a compromise. You're not letting the building what it wants to be, right? And this is no longer the 14th century or whatever. Floor heights are different. Like, why do we have to do this?
It's interesting, when I was in school, in architecture school, for a long time, I wanted to be work in the preservation, to be an architect, to do like preservation work. And there is like special training you have to do after you get your degree to go into like restoration and understanding like all of that stuff. And I don't know, I was like, oh yeah, it would be really cool, like restoring old things, putting them back together. And now I'm like, yeah, no, thank you. Great job. Those buildings are aging. That's fine. Let's them age. Maybe let's take care of them here and there. But no, I can't do that.
Yeah, it's a different philosophical difference between people.
So let me ask. So we spent
but I think your idea of trying to kind of time traveling in a city is really interesting. It kind of makes me feel like when I see, I know most of Paris is historic, but when I see this building, and if I imagine there were more of these structures in Paris, the city becomes kind of like a tapestry of time rather than being like this fix that it has to conform. And that's why I'm so against HOAs. It's like, shut up. Like, no, we don't have to all conform.
I'm against HOAs because
Like,
most of the
this?
communities that have HOAs, the homes look like crap.
That's true too. That's true too.
Why are we not trying to do better here?
That's true too. You have a homeowners association to dictate how things look, but all your houses are crappy, and the people in charge of the HOA know nothing about design, aesthetics, or architecture. So, really, you've just created a cult of crappiness.
I mean,
why do we have to adhere to this?
If you're in a neighborhood of Farnsworth houses or Falling Waters or Eichlers and you have an HOA, like, respect. Fine. I get it. You're trying to keep something intact here that has value. But, you know, when you see like faux whatever type of houses, like faux Spanish style houses all over California, let's all stick to the same color, stucco. Let's make sure we all have the same front door and that, you know, the roof tiles are matching. And it's like, but for what reason?
The other reason why, so there's some validity to HOAs or the equivalent of those organizations, because on the scale of a neighborhood, especially in an urban setting, you do want some level of consistency for the place to feel beautiful.
Well, I mean, if you know you have terrible taste, then yeah, you can rely on the HOA to make the decisions for you of what you should be doing.
But if you have terrible taste, you should not be the one in charge of the HOA either. And that's the problem, is that, and the other thing too, the reason why I really disagree with a lot of these kinds of regulations and organizations at the scale of a private neighborhood with single family houses, and even the scale of a city, aside from the inept people are being in charge, is that it's a very superficial way of understanding things, and I'm just I don't like that, especially when I think about single family houses in a neighborhood. You know, this like 8.5 by 11 12-page printout of text of like, you can only use this spectrum of colors, and you can only do a house that's only this tall, and the front door must be this, but none of that has anything remotely to do with good architecture. It simply has to do with conformity, superficial conformity across multiple houses, which, you know, it's just... Well,
if I was a homeowner too in those communities, I feel like I would want to be able to do whatever I want with my house. You know?
I'm all for that. I really believe if you own a piece of property and you are building on it, as long as you're not intruding on other people's your neighbors in terms of daylight and air, like fundamental things like that, then you should be able to do whatever you want.
No.
Literally whatever you want, like truly whatever you want. Unless what you're building is so unsafe for an average person that there's a 50% chance they're going to break a leg. That's probably the cutoff. But before that 50%, do whatever you want. Why are we trying to control what people... It's their property. Let them do whatever they want. So
my question to you was, we spent the last hour and 15 minutes talking about my 3 favorite buildings.
We did, and it's time to end the recording and have lunch, which I'm very excited for.
So you did most of the talking, so you would avoid talking about your 3 favorite buildings. I see your strategy.
Was there anything about your 3 favorite buildings you did not get to say that you would like to say? Knowing that we have all the time in the world.
Take me back.
Take you back to the 3 buildings.
To the 3 buildings? No, actually, I would love to see those buildings, well, except the Pompidou, because I've seen it plenty. But I would love to go back there. Yeah. But I would love to see Falling Water during the winter.
Yeah.
And same for Farnsworth.
Yeah.
There is something about, especially when you are building in climate zones that have strong seasons, that just really changes what the architecture looks like or feels like. And, seeing things in green is one thing, but seeing it in all the snow. I remember when we went to China and we visited Forbidden City in the snow. I still think about those images, quite often actually. And it just felt like a dream. Like it felt like I was walking into a dream. Mm-hmm. The place did not feel real. Mm-hmm. There is kind of like, there is the quietness that the snow has, just because it just deadens everything. but and the light and I don't know, it's mesmerizing. So I would love to see this building in the snow.
Also, if you visit a place during the winter, it's less busy. That's the problem with some of these structures, like falling water. It was so crowded when we visited that it was really hard to get a sense of the space. But actually, the energy in the space was just chaos because there's so many people going here and there. It was just hard to even understand anything.
Yeah.
You're trying to get around without bumping into people. Yeah, I mean, I had visited Tiananmen Square, and then is it the Imperial Palace? I don't know. What the big structure that's right adjacent to it, the one that you were talking about, Forbidden City, right? During the summer, as well. Completely different, completely different. And I don't know. I'm torn because the nice thing about summer or when it's not snowing is you can see everything. Right.
Yeah, no, everything is uncovered, so yeah, you can.
But there's a really special quality when there's snow.
I think also like in the human physical experience, like when it's cold and you're bundled up and you have to like be careful where you're walking and you're kind of like uncomfortable in your puffy jacket and trying to like get the camera and like everything becomes more special because it takes more effort. And therefore, maybe you appreciate it more. I don't know. Like you're more present.
Yeah. Those types of structures too, for the Forbidden City specifically, and a lot of other places we visited in China. What was that one? It was like the summer vacation palace of the emperor or whatever. I forget what it was called. Giant place.
Where was that?
I'm terrible. Probably in Beijing. Yeah, it would have been in Beijing. But those types of places are also...
Oh, with the tea pavilions, like the zillion tea pavilions that were there?
Probably. I know the English name is something summer. But
I think so. There was water and yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it's called the Summer Palace. Imperial Garden. It could be. But anyway, with those category of structures are also equally impressive. But it's hard for me to ever name, structures built for emperors are also have their own kind of baggage with it. But it's hard for me to name those or think of those as favorite places because the criteria, it's just the criteria and the setting which allow that to happen is so fundamentally different that it's like.
Well, you're talking monuments, so it's kind of like, I mean, I was thinking about my favorites. I'm like, okay, should I pick one from like the French history that I've seen?
You have an obligation to do so.
It's like, well, Versailles was pretty cool. I mean, I guess that could be one of my favorite, but it's like it's different categories, right? And there is something special about those buildings, like visiting old castles and stuff, but I wouldn't say they're my favorite.
I mean, again, what's interesting, I think the three that you chose are very clear expressions of very specific ideas. And if you use that as a way to understand the projects, the thing with like the Emperor Palace or Versailles, I don't know, were there really ideas?
Well, it was just a beauty competition and a
display of wealth.
Power display.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I
the concepts were not groundbreaking.
No, of course. Yeah.
They were like expected.
Yeah. Just more. Yeah. Give me more.
More gold. More gold on the walls.
Yeah.
More mirrors everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
More tea. Where's the tea?
I don't need bread though. I don't need bread. Okay. Cool. Well, this is good. So the next part 2 will be your next 3 favorite buildings, and we'll just keep it going forever for the next 100 years. More and more buildings. That's
100 years.
All right, give us an outro.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. If you like what we do, please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and everywhere else you listen to your podcasts. We're also on, where are we on? We're on social media. We're on Instagram, Second Studio Pod. The website, secondstudiopod.com, where all of the episodes are. And we also have the hotline that you can call or send a text message to, 213-222-6950. If you have any guest suggestions, any topics, any favorite buildings that we might not know or we might know, let us know. We're curious.
There's so many buildings I haven't seen, and that's why it's hard to say 3 favorite. It's hard because there's so many buildings you have seen and so many you haven't. It's like unfair to name because you're going to name ones that you've seen, obviously. Well,
also you have to remember what you've seen.
I know.
And that's a whole other issue.
That's the benefit of having iPhones, though. You can go back in
That's what I
time.
did just before this. I was like, okay, I've been there. Oh, that was a good one.
Pre-iPhone, that doesn't exist in
Yeah,
memory.
I know.
You know what I mean? I'm like, I know I saw that building, but it was pre-iPhone, so I guess I'm not going to talk about it. All right, cool. Thanks for listening. Talk soon.
Bye-bye.